Hi, friends. My name is Gerald Dagher. Welcome to episode 2 of the Maron Project. And just to reset, the Maron Project is all about storytelling. So, identifying opportunities and ways that people in marginalized communities can get into different spaces. And who better to tell those stories than the people who work within those spaces today? So, for episode 2, we have a very special guest, and I would like to introduce Armon Dadgar, Chief Technology Officer and co founder of HashiCorp. Armon, how are you?
Doing great. Thanks so much, Gerald. Appreciate you hosting and having me on.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And I think before anything else, I'd like to hear more about you. So if you can tell us a bit about your story and Armon, not as the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of HashiCorp, but Armon as the person. Who are you and what is your story?
Sure. Happy to. So, maybe I'll rewind the clock a little bit and give a bit of a family history and background. I think it's kind of important to maybe how I think about, my own identity. So both my parents were actually born in Iran. So they grew up there, very much kind of were kids up until the sort of Iranian Revolution happened, which, for folks who don't know, obviously sort of in the late 70s, there was sort of an overthrow of the existing regime with the Shah of Iran. And that's when sort of the current sort of Islamic Republic was sort of born. At the time, a whole bunch of folks were displaced out of Iran as a result of that, particularly, maybe the more secular or more sort of educated parts of the society who were sort of enemies of the state, if you will. And so as part of that, both of my parents' families were impacted. And so they ended up becoming sort of political refugees for a while. My dad's family ended up in upstate New York. He was probably 13 or so at the time. Him and his brother were the only basically Middle Eastern people in their school in Troy, New York. They spoke no English. And this was during the American hostage crisis situation where you had Americans taken hostage in Iraq. So you can imagine, their first impression of America and some of their direct treatment wasn't great.
Yeah.
And then my mom's family, they were unable to kind of get visas to come to the US where a bunch of the rest of their family was because of that situation. So they were kind of, traveling through Europe. They basically had no money, didn't speak the language. My mom was about 9 and 10 years old at the time. Eventually, they were able to kind of get into the US. I think my mom was like 12 when she came here, didn't speak any English. Basically, my parents had no money, kind of classic immigrant story. And, kind of growing up working at like Walmart and Kmart so that, they could buy textbooks to put themselves through high school and trying to learn English and sort of, acclimate to this totally different cultures. For them, they ultimately ended up settling in Seattle where I was, born and raised. I think for them, there was always a very strong focus on, hey, we need to get educated and we need to sort of like build a life and career for ourselves. And I think that was something that then they passed on very much to me and my brother as well was, hey, you have to go get an education and go build a career and kind of, think about economic stability. Because I think much of what they went through sort of informed a bit of their life experiences. At the same time, growing up, very much they thought they had one path, and I think both the Great Recession hit as well as 2001. My dad was an electrical engineer who's in that kind of a space, and then my mom was in finance. So when the financial crisis hit in 2008, both of them were sort of laid off, and ultimately ended up for lack of finding a job, ended up creating their own small businesses. And so I think growing up, I kind of got to see that, right? It was both sort of that immigrant mentality of like, education and hard work is super important, but then also being able to kind of see them go from kind of a corporate job to ultimately then saying, hey, we're going to go start a small business of our own. I think planted some seeds for me that sort of showed, hey, it's actually possible to go create a business. And that's a thing that, normal people can do. It's not just something on TV, if you will. And so then for me, I think, personally, I always gravitated to computer science. I was always fascinated by automation. And I think part of where it really was born out for me was sort of seeing my parents have these small businesses where they had a bunch of manual tasks that they would have to do. It was super labor intensive. And I think from pretty early on, and as early as like 13, I started learning like Visual Basic, and I would just help my parents out on, hey, you're doing this manual report every quarter for your company. It takes like 3 weeks. kind of like write some scripts and Excel VB automation to help automate some of that stuff. And what was cool for me was because, I mean, these were some very small businesses, like 2 people. And so when you could see the impact of saying, hey, what took 3 weeks of time, you could automate to an hour. And what does that really translate to a business? That impact is very direct when there's 2 people at a company and you save them 3 weeks a quarter. And so for me, I think that really informed my desire to want to go into computer science. So when I went to University of Washington, I very much had that focus in mind of I want to get into computer science. I want to sort of go focus on that because I feel like there's this, you can drive real business outcomes. Having felt it, sort of tangibly what it means to be able to like do those kind of things. And then I think, it's interesting. I had a pretty, I'd say mixed, if not negative set of experiences during some software internships that made me feel like I didn't want to go into industry. And I decided I wanted to go into academia instead. And so, long story, ended up moving to the Bay Area to actually go get a PhD. And, ultimately my co-founder, Mitchell Hashimoto, sort of convinced me to drop out and join a Bay Area startup. And, I'm sure we can talk about it from there. But yeah, it's been a kind of an interesting road. But maybe that's 2 cents on the background. I think the other piece, maybe just to add in there, given the context of the show, is I identify as openly gay. I'm married to my husband. I'm pretty public about that on Twitter, and I share who my partner is, and I think that's an important part of my identity. But it wasn't always, and I think it was something I certainly struggled with growing up. Especially Middle Eastern culture, it's not necessarily particularly open to it. And so that was something I struggled with all through childhood into college. And I came out sort of in my senior year. And so that was something that I think was another aspect of sort of, you don't see necessarily a lot of openly gay leaders, in technology. There's a handful of notable exceptions, but it's not necessarily very common. But I think an important part of how I self-identify.
Yeah, so even, and that was like story beautiful. And if you look at your identity as a leader, and you touched on something that is very important, there aren't many openly gay leaders in the technology space. So as an executive and a co-founder of an organization like HashiCorp, how does that drive how you approach the business and how you approach the business today?
It's a super good question. I mean, I think about it as, I think representation is super important. And I think, for me, it's how can I be it's this tough battle, which is like, you don't want to become a symbol. And I don't mean that in a way, when I use the word symbol, I mean, you're sort of flattening and compressing a person maybe into a tagline, a slogan, right? I don't believe in that. Like, I'm gay, but I don't identify as being a single dimensional definition of my personality, right? So, I think it's important to say, yeah, I'm openly gay and I'm willing to be a leader of the company and express that as one of the attributes that define my personality. And in some sense, what I've always wanted to project at the company level is that it's so normalized that it's something we almost don't even have to talk about. Because to me, that's the sort of nirvana, is that like, yeah, bring whatever label you want and it doesn't matter. like if it has to matter, then it's like, it almost is like, well, it's a thing we have to talk about and it's an exception and it's how do we have to treat it? And it becomes a thing, versus if it's so like no one shows up and says, you're a male, that's weird, we should talk about it. It's an event. And in some sense, it's like, that's kind of what I wanted to project, is that it should be a non-event that I'm an openly gay leader. And it should be a non-event that you're however you want to identify at the company. And I think that's a little bit of, I think the ethos we've tried to infuse is one of, treat people as you'd want to be treated, right? I think the golden rule and integrity have always sort of sat at the kind of center of how we think about it. And when I think about the principles of HashiCorp that we defined, there's a reason we put integrity, kindness, and humility as the first 3. Right? If you imbue that into the culture, it just becomes like, okay, great, come as you are, right? And I do think culture flows top down. I think you have to set that example. And it's funny to me in many ways that almost one of the last ERGs that was formed at HashiCorp, when I think about our employee resource groups, was the LGBTQ one. And it's not the lack of LGBTQ people, but it's, when I talk to some of the people at the company, I asked them, like, aren't you interested in it? Do you want to organize one? And I think a lot of people's early reactions are like, it's just such a non-event here that it's like, we don't what the ERG talk about. I'm like, great, that was mission success. That's kind of what we wanted.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I will say that HashiCorp, and for those of you who don't know, I am a HashiCorp employee. HashiCorp was one of the first places where I felt like I was just everyone else, right? It was a non-event. I've been used to environments where, yes, I am the only Black person on the team. And I feel like HashiCorp really focuses on, well, we're just people. But even with that mentality, what do you say about, you touched on your identity or parts of your identity not being single dimensional. You're just not this thing. There's so much more to you. What do you say to people who, let's say, current climate, feel like their identity is so much more highlighted and relevant, not because they want it to be, but because they feel like it has to be based off of things that are happening around them?
Hey, first of all, they have my sympathy. I mean, it's a hard situation. There's not a situation I think most people want to be in. I think the vast majority of people want to just live their lives and be who they are, and for it to be a non-event, right? And I think that's not true of all people. I think some people want to highlight certain aspects and want to maybe self-define through certain lenses, and that's okay too. But I think there's a lot of people who are just like, I want to do me, and this is not a political statement. And I think that's hard. I mean, in the same way, I think in many ways I feel fortunate. It's less of a political statement to be a gay man in a room now. I don't think that was always the case, right? And I certainly to people of different generations where they had a very different experience with that, and it was a political statement, right? Even though you didn't intend it to be. So I think it's hard, and I think part of it is society needs to go through a maturation, and I think you saw it happen with thing after thing, right? It used to be being a woman in a workplace was a statement, right? And I think now it's like nobody thinks about that, right? So part of it is society changes, norms change, and those things take time. And unfortunately, there's a crosshair you might be caught in between, where depending on what context you find yourself in, depending on the people you're with, it might be not a statement, and depending with other people, it might be a statement. And I've certainly experienced that myself in a way that can be very uncomfortable, right? Like I've been in rooms where, people see a wedding ring and their assumptions like, tell me about your wife. And sometimes that tone is value neutral, and sometimes that tone is not value neutral, right? And you can tell that there's a certain expectation. And I think, I'll be honest, it's like I've been in those situations where I roll with it. I don't correct, because you pick up on the signal that you're like, it's not going to be welcome, and I'm not in this meeting to make a political statement, And I think that's a luxury I have. It's easy for me to kind of do that code switching and blend in, and not everybody has that. So, that's where I sympathize. I think it's hard. I sincerely wish we were all in a situation where you didn't have to make that a political statement unless you were trying to, unless you wanted to. And I think for those who can code switch, I've often talked to people who, it's like you might make that decision in the moment, but not everybody can. And I think those are the harder situations for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you touched on code switching, so we will slightly open that door. For you, what is code switching, and how important is it in navigating the business space?
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is, and I've talked about it in a few different contexts, which is, to me, it's about sort of it's an understanding of your audience and a contextualization of how you communicate, is maybe how I define it, right? So, for example, if I'm with an audience that, I've been in these situations. Maybe I'm in the deep South. I'm there for a customer meeting. The context of the meeting is I'm there to talk about, let's say, a product. But obviously, there's the chit chat, the get to know you, the before and after. Maybe you're taking them to. And so some of those conversations might veer out of the professional and into the personal by nature of that setting. And that's where you might get into a question like, tell me about your wife. Where did you guys meet? Do you have kids? Whatever. Which become personal questions, but all of a sudden, you have to make a decision of, hey, this person's let's say a buyer, they're a decision maker. I need them to like me. In that capacity, I'm not showing up as necessarily Armon, the person they're friends with. I'm showing up with as Armon, the ambassador to a company who they might be doing business with. And to me, that's where I'm making a code switching decision to say, okay, how do I need to present? Am I presenting as Armon the individual who might talk about my husband as an openly gay man, or am I Armon the ambassador to HashiCorp who, that's not really relevant, and the right thing is maybe not to bring that up knowing the context of this audience, right? And I think that's hard, right? And I think I've talked to people who find that challenging because they're like, well, why not use that as an opportunity to maybe challenge a prejudice?
Yeah.
Why not bring that into the conversation? And I respect that. I think to me, I probably bring a bit of a pragmatism to my job, which is maybe I would do that in a personal setting if I'm at a barbecue at a friend's house, but in a professional setting, that's not what I'm paid to do. Right? Like it's not my job, right? In some sense, right? And so I put my fiduciary interest of the company first. And I get some people are uncomfortable with that, but I think there's a pragmatism to it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's kind of how I think about it, right? It's sort of like understanding my audience, understanding what my role is in relation to that audience, and then sort of modulating how I might communicate or present myself.
I love that. So thinking about where you are today, what would you tell someone who is starting from scratch, right? You spoke about the immigrant family and parent story, and I have a similar story, and I think I've shared things with you about what I've done for my parents because they did have to work a lot harder. What would you say to those people who are in those environments where they feel like, well, I'm starting from scratch. The odds are completely against me. I don't have a $1 million loan or gift from someone to get my business started. What would you say to those people?
What I'd say is it's incredible when I look at the number of people I work with that come from incredibly diverse and non-traditional backgrounds. Right? I think people have a perception that there's maybe one golden path in, or one, whatever you want to call it, sort of one clearly well-defined, if you're not on this sort of pathway, it doesn't work. And I don't think that's the case at all, right? When I look at so many of the people that I've interacted with, that I've worked with, that have been at HashiCorp, that, we've partnered with, many of them came from all sorts of different backgrounds, right? Some of them or at 10 years old knew this is what they wanted to do. Other people switched into technology when they were 50 years old, right? And they came into it at different points in their life. And so I don't think it's necessarily a question of like, hey, if I didn't start on this track, I can never get into it. I think it's about, well, where's your determination and passion, and do you want to get into it, right? I have, a bunch of people who I would say were self-taught. They started doing they picked up a book on Python and they learned JavaScript and they taught themselves into this world. And, they maybe got an entry-level job doing, HTML type front-end work. And then over time they got into back-end systems and now they're back-end system engineers. I've worked with other people who they started in the military and, they were in the Navy or they were in the Air Force and they were maybe a mechanic and they, started there. And then over time they sort of changed roles and they got interested in IT and maybe it started in system administration and, moved their way into sort of technology management. You have other people that did start in university, but maybe not in a degree that you'd expect, right? And our fourth employee at HashiCorp had a degree in philosophy, right? Now, almost no real connection to computer science. But I think it was an interest and a passion in technology that brought him over. He started more on sales and marketing side and then grew into product management. So my point to all of that is to just say, if your heart is there and your interest is in there, I wouldn't treat it as there's only this one doorway. And if you don't cross that, there's no way in. I think there's many, many different paths into technology. There's many different roles in technology. And so to me, it's about getting started. It's about starting to build knowledge base, because I think there's no way around it that in particular these domains, they depend on fairly specialized knowledge. And I think you got to go learn that. And there's no shortcut to that. But I think if you're self-determined to go do that, whether you're doing it in a structured way through university, or you're doing online classes, or you're self-taught, or you're getting it through an experiential sort of apprenticeship type model of kind of getting hands-on, all of those are really about skill building, right? Knowledge building. And I think that becomes sort of the entryway. And then once you're in, none of us know all of these things. You're going from one role to the next and you're learning as you go.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking about that learning journey, one of the really cool things that I've seen at HashiCorp is our internship program. And I reconnected with some of our interns at Afrotech when we went last year and the year before. So why is that kind of program important to you? So getting the younger generations or communities involved early on. And it's not all engineering, right? Our internships kind of span the organization from product management and so many other things. So why is that a critical component of how we operate for you?
I think about it as a few things, right? I mean, I think part of it is selfish for the company. It's like, hey, how do we attract talent? And it's a good recruiting mechanism, right? But more than that is honestly, it's a bit more than it's a giving back, because there's other ways that we can recruit. And frankly, honestly, most of the time with interns, it's almost like you're doing more work in terms of mentoring and training than you are in terms of output that you get. So yeah, part of it's maybe selfish hiring, but honestly, I do think on it more as like it's an opportunity for us to actually give back and create sort of opportunities for a diverse set of folks to maybe, find a pathway into these organizations that they might otherwise not, right? And I think that's the more sort of community give back aspect of it. I think particularly for our internship program, we aim pretty broadly. It's not like we go narrowly, say, okay, it's only Stanford and MIT and UW or whatever. We tend to aim broad. We go to maybe schools that are historically underrepresented in terms of, getting poached for these things. But then we also look at people who are coming from non-traditional backgrounds, right? Who want to get into tech, who are looking for sort of that first entryway in. So I think for us, we really did try and develop it as it's not just internship, it's sort of early career or first career in tech as well. And really looking at it as an opportunity, like how do we help create a pathway? And I think for some people, it's because it's their first experience, they might try it and decide tech's not for them, and that's okay. But I think for a lot of other people, they are like, I don't really know what this is. Let me try it out in a relatively low risk way. I commit 3-6 months or whatever. And they find they love it. And those people come and rejoin us. And, that becomes their first step into sort of a technology career. And to me, I think that's what's exciting, especially when I look at sort of the diversity of folks we're able to attract through the internship program. It's very different than what you would maybe get through a traditional recruiting pipeline of people that are senior in their career and have been in industry for a while, just because by that point in the pipeline, it looks very different.
Yeah, so one really cool thing about this conversation, this is not scripted. All of these questions are just based off of the discussion that we're having now. And you touched on what we do being top down and setting that example at the highest levels of the organization. And one of the really cool things that I've seen here at HashiCorp is during our debriefs for interviews, when we have our interview panels, I remember a senior director asking, well, is this the best candidate? Or is this the best candidate that we've given an opportunity to? Have we not considered more diverse candidates? And that was really impactful for me as a Black male, because I feel like there are so many opportunities that don't exist because we look for what is normal, like what are the norms. So I think that example that you spoke about being set is really critical. So thinking about, like, how do you do that in an organization, right? You have over 2,000 people at HashiCorp now. How do you lead that organization to be more diverse and set those things? Like, is it early on in the company's life cycle, or is it something that progresses as the company matures?
It's a really good question. I never forget I had an opportunity to have dinner with John Chambers, who ran Cisco for many, many years. And it was a super insightful conversation. I mean, there's rare that you get to talk to a tech executive who ran a company from small scale to, international, global scale for so long. And he had an incredible set of insights into like, what does it take to run a company and keep it competitive and innovative and operate at that kind of scale? And one of the most interesting things he talked about was culture and the role culture plays in a company. And his view was basically culture eats strategy, for breakfast. And, I think his point was, you as an executive leader cannot sit in every single meeting. You can't sit on every single decision that's happening, at a company of any, real scale. So his point is, how do you make it as if you're sitting in that meeting and as if you're influencing that decision, even though you're not? And his point was like, the only way to do that is culture, right? Like you have to sort of imbue the company with the culture of what is the decision John Chambers would have made if he was in this meeting? And how do you get that to sort of operationalize at every level of the company? And he's like, that is what culture is. And that's the reason culture flows top down, is because ultimately what's happening is you're taking the cultural values and the decision-making process of the leadership, you're distilling that into culture. And that's sort of what you're sort of encouraging, you're infusing, you're reinforcing throughout the organization. And I thought that was really powerful. So I think as we thought about HashiCorp and designing, how we run and our principles, like we were very intentional about it. We codified our principles from a very early day, and we baked those in to sort of how we do everything, right? And I think, I think the Netflix folks said it really well, which is culture is 70% who you hire, it's 20% who you promote, and it's 10% who you fire. Because ultimately it's about hiring the right people that live those principles When you're promoting people, it's elevating the people who embody them. And then when you terminate, you have to look at it through the lens of like, where is there a misalignment to culture, because that festers, right? And I think it's super important to protect the culture in that way. And so I think throughout time, we were always very deliberate with that at HashiCorp in terms of really reinforcing that. We've always had someone whose role on an interview panel is the culture screen, right? The principal screen. When we look at promos, we look at it through that lens, especially for senior leadership when we start talking about VP levels and up. And I think same thing, it's a key driver of a bunch of, I'll call it involuntary, exits, is when we feel like there's a cultural misalignment. So to me, that's about how we do that. It's about defining those principles of, hey, we care about integrity, we care about humility, we care about pragmatism. And many of those things to me are about creating that inclusive culture where we care about these aspects of the company. And then it's reinforcing that throughout. And I think that's, to me, one of the things I'm most proud of is the fact that we've scaled the company from 2 people to 2,500 people and kept that cultural center, if you will.
That has been amazing for me, like coming into HashiCorp and meeting all the people. And I remember asking myself, and I had a conversation with my partner and going, I don't know how they got this many people who were just so cool and so chill and so nice, and everyone willing to help. Now, throughout the conversation, you've touched on a couple of things in a relatively passive way that tie back to the power of an individual. So being passionate, being driven about what you want to do to target something and to get there. So for people in marginalized communities who do feel like, well, there's so many things, there's this mountain in front of me that I have to chip away at. What do you do when you get discouraged? So there is a lot of discouragement that can occur. And for me, imposter syndrome was a very large thing when I joined HashiCorp. And I remember asking myself, do I belong here? Because there's so many of these people that are amazing. How do you keep that determination and drive and passion when it does feel like the odds may be stacked against you?
I think it's a really good question. And I think, in some sense, I think the secret of all this stuff is that everyone feels those same feelings and they feel it at every level, right? And it never goes away. I was doing a panel interview with our interns as part of our kind of new hire welcome thing. And the topic of imposter syndrome came up. And, one of the things I told them is like, I still feel it all the time. And I think the interns were shocked. They're like, how is that possible? Like, you're the co-founder, you're the CTO, like, what does it mean for you to feel imposter syndrome? And I was like, yeah, but it doesn't change. And I think people are surprised. Like, I have this conversation with senior executives all the time, both at HashiCorp and other companies and peers that I work with. And yeah, I mean, you set these folks down to dinner and have a private conversation, and everyone will admit to it, right? Regardless of their level. It's not just the interns who feel it, right? All the way up to senior executives, everyone feels the same way, which is, we're constantly learning. We're constantly being challenged by new things. You're constantly being put into new environments where maybe you don't have the experience or the familiarity. And I think it's normal to feel like, hey, does everyone else know what they're doing? And am I the only one who's figuring it out? And I think certainly for me, as having kind of gone through this journey, first-time founder, never built an enterprise technology company, never even worked for one. And so to kind of be in many, many of these situations where oftentimes we're, in a meeting with a customer telling us like, what do you think our infrastructure strategy should be? The number of times I've sat there thinking to myself, like, why are they asking me? I'm like, how am I the expert that's supposed to tell, a global bank what their security posture should be? Right? And you're having a conversation with the CISO. You're like, okay, the 20-year CISO is asking me what their security strategy should be. So, it's impossible to not feel that kind of imposter syndrome there. So I think my point in saying that is not to say that, it's that it happens at every level. It's not just a thing that you feel that you're like, okay, once I get to this next level, then I'm going to feel confident. No, I guarantee you'll feel it there, and you'll feel it at the next level, and you'll feel it at the next level. And so I think the point to it is, in some sense, one of the examples I point to that's, another one of the, I think, great success stories of HashiCorp was our first sales engineering leader, who joined with no background in DevOps, no background in technology. He really just wanted to work with the team, was super passionate about, he's like, I want to get into tech and I want to get into sort of this domain. And I love the team and he wanted to come work with us. And he was maybe, I don't remember, first 10 or 20 employees. And the thing that he did that I still stand in incredible respect of is that his incredible grit is what made him not only become a great SC when he was our first SC hire. He committed to I'm going to learn DevOps. I'm going to learn all of our tools. I'm going to learn the landscape. And he became an incredible sales engineer. But then he became our first SC manager, and he started hiring that team. And he really focused himself on finding mentors and learning from people who are further ahead on the journey from him on how do I become an great SC manager? And then how do I build a great SC org? And ultimately, he grew up from our first SC hire to running worldwide sales engineering with more than 250 people under him, global function around the world, many countries, everything from our enablement to training to service delivery, the whole motion. And again, his background wasn't in technology. He didn't study tech in school. He didn't have a previous career in technology and started as our first SC. And what made it work is that he had the grit to sort of over back then when he was in, and he would tell me, he's like, we're in these meetings because we'd go in together oftentimes. And he'd be like, Armon, they asked this question that I don't understand. It's out of my depth. And it's impossible to not have that imposter syndrome when you're in that meeting being expected to be the SE, right? But he put in the effort, he put in the work to learn it, get 1% better each one of those meetings, and ultimately sort of ran a global function, right, over the course of many, many years at HashiCorp. So to me, I think those kind of stories really kind of highlight the fact that it's not for lack of having those moments of doubt. It's for putting in the work to kind of overcome them.
I love that. So a couple of questions before we close out. For you, and thinking about that imposter syndrome that people do have, how powerful are the words, I don't know? I feel like there are many times where we are asked the question and we assume that, well, I should know this thing, but I don't know it. How powerful and useful are the words, I don't know, and how okay is it to not know something?
It's an incredibly powerful thing. I think people often fall into sort of what I'll call the ego trap of feeling like they have to know, or that if they admit they don't know, it's some sort of, I don't know, moral defeat. I don't know, however you want to think about it. But I think sometimes the most powerful answer is exactly being able to say, I don't know, but I'm going to find out and get back to you. Right? Because if you're on the receiving end of that, you're like, that's okay. I'm not expecting you to be, God mode, that you know everything. Right? But your commitment to saying, let me find out and get back to you, right? I think that's all the difference. That but is the whole difference. I think if you end the statement as I don't know, period, that's a very different statement than saying I don't know, comma, but let me get back to you. Right? Because I think one is a commitment to saying I'm going to go learn, I'm going to go grow. And the next time you ask me, I will know the answer to that question. Right? And I think that's a really powerful thing. And I think, once you sort of free yourself up from the, I don't know, embarrassment or discomfort of saying that, I have found in almost every situation, people accept that. I mean, I think there's rare case where it's something you probably really should know, in which case it's maybe just embarrassing and you didn't do your homework. But I think in most cases, if it's not a thing that is obvious table stakes knowledge, I think people they understand. It's a death.
I love that. So last question. Sitting in the spot that you are in today and HashiCorp joining the IBM family of companies, right? That very long journey that you've had and all of those things that you've learned. What would you say to 16-year-old kids representing a marginalized community, whether they are Black, from the LGBTQIA community, or anything else, and they're trying to figure out, where do I go? Where do I start? What do you say to them?
That's a great question. I think, to me, it's probably a few things. I think one is you got to find your tribe. You got to find your people, because I think these roads are never linear. They have their ups and downs. They have their setbacks. And I think if you're not surrounding yourself with people that are supportive, that are your champions, that are a support network for you, it's exponentially harder, right? Like if you feel like you're on your own. And I think no matter what community you come from, there's a community of people just like you, right? And so I think it's super important to find those people. And I think almost universally what you'll find is people are willing to lend a helping hand. They're willing to make introductions. They're willing to mentor. They're willing to coach. They're willing to Just be a sounding board. And sometimes you need that when you've had a tough day, week, month, year, whatever, right? And so I think finding your tribe is super important because I think it gives you that network, that support. And I think the second part of it is, you learn to be your own harshest critic, right? And what I mean by that is I think if you depend on external validation or external people's opinion, there's always going to be naysayers. There's always going to be the people saying it can't be done and you can't do it, whatever. And I think for me, it's always been learning to be my own harshest critic. And I don't mean that in a negative way necessarily. It's just, it's saying, okay, the critic's voice that I care the most about is my own, right? Other people are going to say I can't do it, but I don't care. So it's going to be my own opinion of what I can and can't do, right? And to sort of more of that, take the leap of faith and believe in yourself, if you will.
I love that.
Is I think super critical because there's always going to be those people, right? And I think if you depend on the outside voice telling you you can or can't do it, I think that makes the journey a lot.
That is amazing. So that was our last question. Armon, thank you so much for joining and giving us the time to tell your story. Please tune in for the next episode of the Maron Project. Later.
Thanks so much, Gerald.